A flight bound for uncertainty. The hum of the airplane engines was a steady backdrop to the bustle of passengers finding their seats. Flight attendants smiled politely, their voices cheerful as they directed travelers to their assigned spots. In first class, a woman in her mid-30s settled into her plush leather seat with an air of practiced superiority. Madison Harper, a corporate executive accustomed to luxury, checked her reflection in her compact mirror. Her blonde hair was styled immaculately, and her designer outfit screamed exclusivity. She barely glanced at the other passengers boarding, her focus instead on her tablet displaying the latest stock market updates. Madison's sense of entitlement was shaken when a tall black man in a crisp military uniform entered the cabin. His presence immediately commanded attention, not only because of his stature, but also because of the medals displayed on his chest. He looked proud yet modest, nodding courteously to the flight attendant who directed him to the seat beside Madison. Madison's lips pursed as she watched him place his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. She shifted uncomfortably, her annoyance palpable. When he sat down, she glared at him and let out a sharp sigh. "I think you're in the wrong seat," she said coldly, her voice loud enough for others to hear. The man glanced at her, his dark eyes calm and steady. "No, ma'am. This is 3B, he replied, his voice even but firm. "Well," she sniffed, "I paid for first class, and I don't believe this is where you belong." The murmur of nearby passengers ceased as Madison's words hung in the air. The man's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "I paid for this seat as well, Mom." Unwilling to back down, Madison pressed the call button for the flight attendant. When the young woman arrived, Madison launched into a tirade. "This is unacceptable. I'm not sitting next to someone like him. I demand he be moved immediately." The flight attendant blinked, taken aback by Madison's blatant prejudice. "Ma'am," she began diplomatically, "Sergeant Bennett is a paying passenger, just like you. He has every right to sit here." Madison scoffed, her voice rising. "Move him to coach or something. First class isn't for people like him." By now, the entire cabin had fallen silent. All eyes were on the unfolding scene. The man, whose uniform bore the name Sergeant Alexander Bennett, remained stoic. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Madison's escalating fury. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I'm going to ask you to lower your voice. We cannot move passengers without cause." "I am the cause," Madison snapped. "If you don't handle this, I'll file a complaint with your airline. Do you even know who I am?" At that moment, the pilot, Captain Harris, stepped out of the cockpit, alerted by the commotion. His presence was commanding, his uniform adding authority to his words. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between Madison and the flight attendant. "This man shouldn't be in first class," Madison declared, her tone dripping with entitlement. "I paid for this seat, and I shouldn't have to share it with someone who doesn't belong." Captain Harris's jaw clenched, his patience visibly tested. He turned to Sergeant Bennett. "Is everything all right, sir?" Sergeant Bennett nodded. "I'm fine, Captain. I don't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing trouble," the captain said firmly, his voice loud enough for the cabin to hear. "You're welcome here, just as much as anyone else." Turning to Madison, Captain Harris's tone hardened. "Ma'am, this behavior is unacceptable. You can either treat your fellow passengers with respect, or you'll need to leave this aircraft." Madison's face flushed crimson. "You can't be serious. I have a meeting to get to, and I won't be inconvenienced because—" "We take matters of discrimination very seriously," Captain Harris interrupted. "Security has already been notified." Madison's protests were cut short as two uniformed officers boarded the plane. Realizing the severity of the situation, she grew pale. "Wait, this isn't necessary. I'll behave." "It's too late for that," the captain said sharply. "You're being removed." As the officers escorted a fuming Madison off the plane, applause erupted from the passengers. Sergeant Bennett, still silent, gave a small nod of gratitude to the captain and the flight attendant. He resumed his seat, adjusting his uniform with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. The flight took off shortly after, the cabin finally at ease. Passengers exchanged whispers about the incident, many expressing their admiration for Sergeant Bennett's composure. Yet, none could have guessed the astonishing twist that awaited Madison the following day, one that would force her to confront the depth of her prejudice and the weight of her actions, shadows of the past. The following day, Madison Harper sat in her luxury apartment, nursing a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. She was scrolling through her phone, seething with indignation. The events of the previous evening played on a loop in her mind. Being removed from the plane had felt like a public humiliation, a punishment she felt was wholly undeserved. Her anger bubbled as she typed a scathing email to the airline, demanding an apology and threatening legal action. Before she could hit send, a notification popped up on her screen. It was a link to a viral video. Her curiosity piqued. Madison tapped it, only for her face to fill the screen. The video was unmistakable. It captured her argument with the flight attendant, her heated demands to have Sergeant Bennett removed, and the applause as she was escorted off the plane. The comments below the video were merciless. Unbelievable. This is the kind of ignorance we're still dealing with in 2025. Respect to Sergeant Bennett for staying calm. He's a better person than I'd ever be in that situation. She's the perfect example of why we still have so much work to do. The hashtags #ResistOnBoard and #RespectOurTroops were trending, and Madison's name was plastered across social media. Her email inbox was flooded with messages, many of them hateful, and her phone buzzed with calls and texts. Madison, who had built her career on projecting an image of professionalism and poise, was now the face of everything she had never wanted to be associated with: prejudice, ignorance, and privilege. Her panic grew when she saw a headline on a major news site. Executive embarrasses herself, humiliates decorated soldier. Beneath it was a brief profile of her professional life, her title at a prestigious firm, and even a photo of her apartment building. In an attempt to salvage her reputation, Madison picked up the phone and called her boss. Madison, her boss said coldly, "I've seen the video." "Then you understand how unfairly I was treated," Madison replied, her voice defensive. "I was removed for expressing the simple preference." Her boss didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was clipped. "The company cannot afford this kind of controversy. You're suspended, effective immediately. HR will be in touch." Madison's stomach churned. "Suspended? You can't be serious." "This is non-negotiable," her boss said. "Goodbye, Madison." The line went dead. Across the city, Sergeant Alexander Bennett was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing online. He had arrived home late the previous night, greeted by the sight of his wife, Lisa, and their 2 children, Marcus and Ava, waiting for him at the airport. "Daddy." Ava, only 6 years old, shrieked as she ran into his arms. Alexander knelt, wrapping her in a tight embrace, the weariness of his deployment melting away. Marcus, his 12-year-old son, was more reserved but still smiled warmly as he gave his father a firm handshake. Lisa stepped forward, her smile radiant. "Welcome home," she whispered, tears in her eyes as she hugged him tightly. That morning, Lisa noticed something strange as she checked her phone. She turned to Alexander, who was at the kitchen counter making breakfast for the kids. "Alex," she called, her tone laced with confusion. "You're all over the news." He turned to her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" She handed him her phone, the viral video of the plane incident playing. He watched in silence, his jaw tightening slightly as the scene unfolded. When the video ended, he handed the phone back to her and resumed flipping pancakes. "Do you want to talk about it?" Lisa asked gently. Alexander shook his head. "No, I didn't do anything wrong. That's enough for me." But as the day went on, the outside world refused to leave him in peace. His phone rang constantly, calls from reporters, old friends, and even strangers who had found his number. His social media accounts, which he rarely used, were flooded with messages of support. While Alexander tried to maintain his quiet life, Madison's world continued to crumble. Her lawyer, whom she had hastily contacted, advised her to issue a public apology. "You need to address this, Madison," he said firmly. "The longer you stay silent, the worse this will get." Madison resisted. "I don't see why I should have to apologize. That man is a decorated soldier," her lawyer interrupted. "And you humiliated him in front of an entire plane of people. You're being labeled a racist. If you don't do something to change the narrative, your career is over." Reluctantly, Madison drafted an apology. It was sterile, full of corporate speak, and entirely devoid of sincerity. Her lawyer reviewed it and shook his head. "This isn't good enough," he said. "You need to be honest. Acknowledge what you did and show remorse." Madison's indignation flared. "I don't owe anyone honesty. This is damage control. You owe the truth to yourself," he said, his tone softening. "If you can't see that, then I can't help you." The phone call ended, leaving Madison alone with her thoughts. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. Had she really been wrong? The voice of the man on the plane, steady, calm, and unyielding, echoed in her memory. Meanwhile, Alexander received an unexpected call. A local journalist wanted to interview him, not just about the incident, but about his life and military career. At first, he hesitated, disliking the attention. But Lisa encouraged him. "Maybe this is a chance to show people who you are," she said, "not just as a soldier, but as a person." Reluctantly, Alexander agreed. The interview took place at a local park, the backdrop serene and tranquil. The journalist, a young woman named Nina, was thoughtful in her questions, focusing on his service and the values he held dear. "Your composure during that incident was remarkable," she said. "How did you stay so calm?" Alexander thought for a moment before answering. "I've faced worse situations in life. People like her, they don't define me. I know who I am, and I know the people I fight for." The interview aired that evening, earning widespread praise for Alexander's humility and grace. It painted a stark contrast to Madison's refusal to accept responsibility. That night, Madison finally broke. She sat on her couch, staring at her phone, the video of the plane incident playing on repeat. For the first time, she didn't see herself as the victim. She saw a woman consumed by arrogance and ignorance, lashing out at someone who had done nothing wrong. Tears streamed down her face as she turned off the video. The next day, she contacted her lawyer. "I'll apologize," she said quietly, "but it has to be real." And so, Madison began to draft a new statement, one that would begin her journey toward confronting not just the consequences of her actions, but the prejudices that had fueled them. A soldier's legacy. The sound of birds chirping drifted through the open window as Alexander Bennett sat at his dining table, sipping his morning coffee. The sunlight poured in, highlighting the walls adorned with family photos and military memorabilia. His wife, Lisa, busied herself in the kitchen, humming softly while the kids played in the living room. It was an ordinary day, yet Alexander's mind felt far from ordinary. The previous night's interview had sparked a tidal wave of attention, far beyond what he had anticipated. The video clip of his composed response on the plane and his thoughtful words during the interview were being shared widely. Messages of gratitude and admiration continued to flood his inbox. One message stood out among the rest. It came from an older man named Robert Greene, who introduced himself as Madison Harper's uncle. "Dear Sergeant Bennett, my name is Robert Greene, and I want to start by offering my deepest apologies for my niece's actions. Her behavior was inexcusable, and I hope you know that not all of us share her views. There's something you need to know about her, something she doesn't even fully understand. Her grandfather, Charles Greene, was a soldier too. He served in the same war you've dedicated your career to honoring, though under very different circumstances. He was part of an all-black unit during World War I. the 761st Tank Battalion. I realize this might sound unbelievable, given Madison's actions, but it's the truth. I thought you should know. Alexander read the email twice, his brows furrowed. The 761st Tank Battalion. The legendary Black Panthers. He was well versed in their history, having studied their bravery and resilience in the face of both enemy fire and systemic racism. The irony of Madison's connection to such a unit wasn't lost on him. "Lisa," Alexander called out, his tone thoughtful. "You need to read this." Lisa dried her hands and came over, reading the email over his shoulder. Her grandfather was in the 761st. She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. How could she not know that? Alexander shrugged. A lot of families bury their past, especially when it's tied to painful truths. Lisa gave him a knowing look. "So, what are you going to do?" He paused, considering. "I'm not sure yet, but it feels like something worth exploring." Meanwhile, in her high-rise apartment, Madison Harper sat at her desk, staring at a draft of her apology statement. She had spent hours reworking it, her initial defensiveness now replaced with genuine remorse. She had been meeting with a counselor who specialized in racial sensitivity and was beginning to peel back the layers of her upbringing. "I didn't even know my grandfather fought in World War II," she had confessed during one session. "We never talked about it. My family always focused on appearances, on keeping up our image." The counselor had nodded. Sometimes people suppress parts of their history that don't fit the narrative they want to tell, but history has a way of revealing itself. Madison's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found her Uncle Robert standing there, a leather-bound journal in his hands. "Uncle Robert?" she asked, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I came to give you this," he said, holding out the journal. "It belonged to your grandfather." Madison took it hesitantly. "Why are you giving this to me now?" "Because you need to understand who he was," Robert replied, "and who you are." As Madison flipped through the journal that night, her carefully constructed world began to crumble. The pages were filled with vivid accounts of her grandfather's experiences during the war, fighting not just the enemy, but also the prejudice within his own ranks. One entry stood out. November 15, 1944. "We were called to spearhead an attack on a heavily fortified German position. No backup, no recognition, just an order to prove ourselves. We lost so many good men that day. When we returned, there were no parades, no medals, just silence. But I know what we did. We held the line when no one else could. And maybe one day, someone will remember us for it." Tears blurred Madison's vision as she read. She realized she had spent her life oblivious to a history that had shaped her family. Her grandfather's sacrifices, his dignity, and his resilience were a stark contrast to her own behavior. The next morning, Madison called Robert. "I need to know more," she said. "Can you help me understand?" Robert agreed to meet her for lunch, and over the course of the conversation, he shared stories of Charles Greene, the man who had been more than just a soldier. He had been a trailblazer, a fighter for justice, and a man who believed in the power of education and progress. "I don't understand why this was never talked about," Madison said, her voice trembling. "Because it was painful," Robert explained. "Your grandfather came back from the war to a country that still saw him as less than. He buried those memories because it hurt too much to hold on to them." Across town, Alexander received another email, this time from a filmmaker named Claire Richardson. She had seen the viral video and Alexander's interview and wanted to discuss an idea for a documentary about the legacy of the 761st Tank Battalion. "Their story is still so underrepresented," Claire wrote. "Your experience, and Madison's, could be a powerful way to bridge the past and the present." Alexander hesitated. The thought of collaborating with Madison after everything that had happened felt uncomfortable. But as he considered the opportunity, he realized it wasn't about her. It was about honoring the men who had come before him. He replied, "I'm interested. Let's talk." That evening, Madison worked up the courage to write her own email to Alexander. She didn't expect a reply, but she felt it was important to reach out. "Dear Sergeant Bennett, I don't know if you'll ever want to speak to me, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, but I've recently learned something about my family that changes everything for me. My grandfather served in the 761st Tank Battalion. I realize now that my behavior on that plane was not only disgraceful, but also an insult to everything he stood for. I can't undo what I said, but I want you to know that I am committed to understanding and honoring the legacy of men like my grandfather, and like you. If you are willing, I would like to speak with you. No cameras, no press, just a conversation. Sincerely, Madison Harper." Alexander read the email twice. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the twists and turns of the past week. He thought about his own grandfather, a man who had faced unimaginable hardships but never let bitterness consume him. "What would you do, Grandpa?" he whispered aloud. The answer, he realized, was clear. His grandfather would have chosen grace. The next morning, Alexander replied, "Let's meet." A confrontation with truth. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm amber glow over the small cafe where Alexander Bennett and Madison Harper had agreed to meet. The location was neutral, a quiet spot away from the city's prying eyes, chosen for its anonymity. Alexander arrived first, his military precision ensuring he was early. He took a seat at a corner table, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Madison entered a few minutes later, her steps hesitant as she scanned the room. When her eyes landed on Alexander, she paused, nerves clearly etched on her face. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, a stark contrast to the designer outfits she usually favored. It was as if she had shed her armor, arriving not as a corporate executive, but as a woman grappling with her own mistakes. "Sergeant Bennett," she said softly, approaching the table. Alexander stood briefly, nodding politely. "Miss Harper." "Please," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "call me Madison." They sat down, the silence between them thick and heavy. Madison looked down at her hands, which were nervously fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," she began, her voice low. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I felt like I had to say this in person." Alexander folded his hands on the table, his dark eyes steady as he waited for her to continue. "I want to start by apologizing," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "What I did on that plane. It was cruel, ignorant, and completely unacceptable. I've spent the past week trying to understand why I acted the way I did, and the truth is, I don't like what I found." Alexander's expression didn't change, but his silence encouraged her to keep going. "I grew up in a bubble," she admitted. "A world where appearances were everything, and prejudice was unspoken but ever present. I never questioned it. But then this happened, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Especially after I learned about my grandfather." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Your grandfather?" Madison nodded, her voice trembling. "Charles Green. He served in the 761st Tank Battalion during World War I. I didn't know until my uncle gave me his journal. Reading it, it was like meeting a stranger. He was brave, resilient, and everything I'm not. I realize now how much I've dishonored his legacy." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change, to learn." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening slightly. "Change isn't easy," he said finally. "It takes more than words. It takes action." "I know," Madison said, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "That's why I want to be part of something meaningful." Claire Richardson, the filmmaker, reached out to me. She's working on a documentary about the 761st. She wants me to be involved, to share my grandfather's story. But I won't do it without your blessing." Alexander considered her words carefully. He had spent the past few days wrestling with his own emotions, torn between anger and the values his grandfather had instilled in him: forgiveness, resilience, and the importance of finding common ground. "Ms. Harper, Madison," he said, his tone steady, "I appreciate your apology, and I believe you're sincere. If this documentary can shine a light on the sacrifices of the 761st and educate others, then I'll support it. But this isn't about you or me. It's about them, the men who never got the recognition they deserved." Madison nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I promise I'll do everything I can to honor them." Building bridges. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Claire Richardson assembled her team for the documentary. Alexander and Madison were central figures in the project, their unlikely partnership serving as a lens through which to explore the broader story of the 761st Tank Battalion. The film would intertwine historical accounts, personal narratives, and modern-day reflections. For Alexander, the project was deeply personal. He delved into his own family's history, uncovering stories of his great-uncle, who had also served in a segregated unit during World War I. He visited archives, interviewed historians, and even traveled to former battlefields in Europe to honor the places where the 761st had fought. Madison's journey was equally transformative. With her uncle Robert's help, she pieced together her grandfather's story, uncovering not only his heroism, but also the racism he had endured. She read his letters, many of which were filled with frustration and heartbreak over the lack of acknowledgement for his unit's contributions. A visit to the past. One pivotal moment in the documentary's creation came when Alexander and Madison visited the National Museum of African American History and Culture together. They stood before an exhibit dedicated to the 761st Tank Battalion, gazing at photographs, uniforms, and artifacts that told the story of the unit's bravery. Madison's eyes lingered on a black and white photograph of her grandfather, young and resolute, standing beside his tank. She felt a pang of guilt and pride, realizing how little she had known about the man who had shaped her family's legacy. Alexander noticed her expression. "It's powerful, isn't it?" he said quietly. She nodded. "It makes me realize how much history we overlook, how much we take for granted. That's why this matters," Alexander said. "Their stories deserve to be told." Challenges and triumphs. As the documentary neared completion, it faced its share of challenges. Critics emerged, accusing the film of dredging up painful parts of history for personal gain. Alexander and Madison received both praise and backlash, with some questioning Madison's involvement, given her past actions. But the team pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the 761st story was bigger than any individual. Claire Richardson's passion and meticulous research ensured the film was a powerful tribute, highlighting not just the battalion's military achievements, but also their fight for dignity and equality. A revelation. During one of the final interviews, Claire uncovered a long-lost document, an official military memo that confirmed the 761st had been deliberately excluded from recognition after a critical mission. The discovery was a bombshell, adding weight to the documentary's call for justice. "This changes everything," Alexander said when Claire shared the memo. "It's proof of what they endured." Madison, holding a copy of the memo, felt a surge of determination. "We have to make sure people see this," she said. "The world needs to know the truth." As the documentary's release date approached, the momentum behind the 761st story grew. Schools and universities began incorporating lessons about the battalion into their curriculums, and veterans organizations rallied to demand official recognition for the unit. For both Alexander and Madison, the journey had been one of transformation. Alexander found solace in honoring the men who had paved the way for soldiers like him, while Madison discovered a deeper understanding of her own identity and the importance of confronting prejudice. On the eve of the premiere, Alexander and Madison sat side by side, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. "Do you think your grandfather would be proud?" Alexander asked. Madison looked at the journal in her lap, its pages worn but cherished. "I hope so," she said softly. "I hope this is just the beginning of making things right." The world is watching. The night of the documentary's premiere arrived like a whirlwind. The event was held in a historic theater in Washington, D.C., its exterior illuminated by spotlights that danced against the night sky. A red carpet stretched to the entrance, lined with photographers and reporters eager to capture the evening's buzz. The marquee above the theater read in bold letters, "Forgotten Heroes, the 761st Tank Battalion." Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Veterans, historians, and families of the 761st soldiers filled the seats, mingling with educators, activists, and celebrities who had come to honor the story. Alexander Bennett and Madison Harper arrived separately, but were seated together in the front row, a symbolic gesture of reconciliation and progress. As the lights dimmed and the opening credits rolled, Madison felt her chest tighten. She wasn't nervous for herself. She was nervous for her grandfather and the legacy she had come to understand so late. Next to her, Alexander sat stoically, his hands clasped together, his gaze unwavering. A story unearthed. The documentary opened with black and white footage of World War II. Tanks rolling through European battlefields, soldiers trudging through mud, and the haunting faces of men who carried the weight of both war and discrimination. Claire Richardson's voice narrated. They fought on two fronts, one against the enemy abroad, and another against prejudice at home. They were called the 761st Tank Battalion, and their story was almost lost to history. The film transitioned to interviews with surviving members of the battalion, now in their 90s, recounting their harrowing experiences with vivid clarity. They spoke of grueling missions, the camaraderie that kept them going, and the bitterness of returning home to a country that refused to acknowledge their contributions. Madison's grandfather, Charles Green, was prominently featured. Archival footage of him, taken during the war, played on the screen. His voice, recorded in a long-lost radio interview, echoed through the theater. "We didn't fight for medals. We fought because it was the right thing to do. But it's hard, you know, giving everything you've got and still being invisible." Tears welled in Madison's eyes as she heard his words. She glanced at Alexander, who gave her a small, understanding nod. The turning point. The documentary took a dramatic turn when it presented the recently uncovered military memo, a bombshell revelation that exposed the deliberate suppression of the 761st achievements. Historians and military experts weighed in, their voices tinged with both outrage and sorrow. "This isn't just a story of oversight," one historian said on screen. "It's a story of intentional erasure. The men of the 761st didn't just face racism on the battlefield. They faced it in the very institutions that were supposed to honor them." The audience murmured, the weight of the injustice settling heavily in the room. Madison felt a pang of guilt, remembering how her own ignorance had mirrored the systemic neglect of these men's stories. A personal redemption. Midway through the film, the focus shifted to Madison. She appeared on screen, sitting in her apartment, holding her grandfather's journal. Her voice was soft, but resolute as she shared her journey. "I grew up disconnected from this history, unaware of the sacrifices my own grandfather made. When I acted out on that plane, it wasn't just ignorance. It was a failure to honor everything he stood for. This project has been my way of trying to make amends, not just for my actions, but for the silence that allowed this history to be forgotten." The theater was silent, the weight of her words palpable. Madison glanced around nervously, wondering how her vulnerability would be received. To her surprise, she noticed several nods of approval among the audience. The applause. As the credits rolled, the audience rose to their feet, the applause thunderous and unending. Veterans in the crowd saluted, while others wiped tears from their eyes. The names of the soldiers in the 761st scrolled across the screen, each one illuminated by the spotlight of recognition they had been denied for so long. Claire Richardson took the stage, flanked by Alexander and Madison. Her voice trembled with emotion as she addressed the audience. This film isn't just about the 761st. It's about all the stories that have been hidden, all the voices that were silenced. It's about making sure that history is whole and that we honor every sacrifice. She turned to Alexander. Sergeant Bennett, your grace and strength have been an inspiration. Thank you for standing tall, even in the face of adversity. Then to Madison. Miss Harper, your courage to confront your own biases and transform them into action is a lesson for all of us. Thank you for sharing your journey. The applause swelled again as Alexander stepped forward. This isn't about me, he said, his deep voice resonating. It's about them, the men who gave everything for a country that didn't always stand by them. Tonight, we honor their legacy. Madison followed, her voice trembling but clear. I once lived in ignorance, but now I understand the power of truth. I'm grateful for the chance to honor my grandfather and his brothers in arms. This is only the beginning. Ripples of change. The documentary's release sparked a national conversation. Schools began incorporating the 761st into history curriculums, and grassroots campaigns pushed for official recognition of other overlooked units. The Department of Defense, spurred by public outcry, issued a statement acknowledging the injustices faced by the 761st and promised to review other instances of discrimination in military history. For Alexander, the journey felt bittersweet. He continued to speak at events, ensuring the 761st's legacy remained alive. Madison, too, found a new purpose, dedicating herself to educating others and advocating for broader historical inclusion. A legacy fulfilled. Months later, Alexander and Madison stood side by side at a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. The Department of Defense was posthumously awarding medals to the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, finally acknowledging their heroism. Madison clutched her grandfather's medal tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "This is for you, Grandpa." Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder. He'd be proud. As the ceremony concluded, a sense of peace settled over both of them. They had come from vastly different worlds, but through their shared journey, they had found a way to honor the past and shape the future. The fight for a better tomorrow. Months after the emotional ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, the legacy of the 761st Tank Battalion continued to ripple across the nation. News outlets, schools, and communities were engaging with their story like never before. Alexander Bennett and Madison Harper, once strangers on opposite sides of a contentious incident, found themselves at the heart of a growing movement for justice and inclusion. But with progress came challenges. While the documentary and the ceremony had won the battalion overdue recognition, there were still unanswered questions, lingering prejudices, and systemic gaps that needed addressing. A call to action. One afternoon, Alexander sat in his modest home office, reviewing an email from Claire Richardson. Her words were urgent and passionate. "Alex, the momentum we've built with the documentary is incredible, but there's more work to be done. The Department of Defense is reviewing its historical records, but there's pressure from certain groups to limit how far they go. We need to keep the spotlight on this issue. I'm organizing a national summit on military history and diversity. I'd like you to co-chair it with Madison. Let me know if you're in." Alexander leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The idea of working even more closely with Madison still felt complicated. She had made strides, no doubt, but there were moments when her privilege and lack of lived experience in racial matters created friction. Yet he couldn't deny that her journey, and her visible transformation, had inspired others. He picked up his phone and called her. A new collaboration. "Madison," Alexander said when she answered, "I just got an email from Claire. She wants us to co-chair a national summit. Are you interested?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "I am," she said finally, her tone both eager and cautious. "But only if you think we can make a real difference. I don't want this to feel performative." Alexander nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "If we do this, it has to be about substance, not just optics. We'll need to push for actionable change, policy reforms, education initiatives, and funding for veterans programs." "I'm all in," Madison said. "Let's do it." The summit, held in Washington, D.C., was a monumental event. Attendees ranged from military officials and historians to educators and community leaders. Panels discussed the overlooked contributions of minority soldiers, systemic issues within the military's historical record-keeping, and the importance of inclusive education. Alexander and Madison opened the event together. Standing on the stage in front of a packed auditorium, they presented a united front, a symbol of reconciliation and collaboration. Alexander spoke first, his voice steady and commanding. "History is more than just stories from the past. It shapes our present and our future. When we erase or ignore parts of that history, we lose an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to become better as a society." Madison followed, her voice tinged with emotion. "For much of my life, I lived in ignorance of my own family's history. But ignorance is a choice, and I've chosen to confront mine. This summit is about ensuring that no one else has to dig through decades of silence to find the truth." Their speeches set the tone for the day, and the discussions that followed were both challenging and inspiring. Veterans shared their personal stories, some breaking decades of silence to speak about the discrimination they had faced. Educators discussed innovative ways to teach inclusive history, while policymakers debated strategies for addressing systemic inequities. Uncovering more stories. During the summit, a historian approached Alexander and Madison with a surprising discovery. "We found letters from other segregated units that suggest similar erasure tactics were used," she said. "This isn't just about the 761st. It's a pattern." The revelation was both disheartening and galvanizing. Alexander and Madison realized that their work was far from over. They decided to launch a foundation dedicated to uncovering and preserving the stories of marginalized soldiers throughout history. The Legacy of Service Foundation was born. The foundation's mission. The foundation quickly gained traction, fueled by donations and support from veterans organizations, universities, and private donors. Its mission was threefold: research and recognition, partnering with historians to uncover overlooked contributions of marginalized soldiers, and advocating for official recognition. Education, developing curriculum resources for schools and colleges to teach a more inclusive version of military history. Veterans support, providing grants and programs for minority veterans who faced systemic barriers in accessing health care, housing, and career opportunities. Madison threw herself into the foundation's work, leveraging her corporate connections to secure funding and partnerships. Alexander became the face of the organization, traveling across the country to speak at events and meet with veterans. Personal growth. The work transformed them both. Alexander, who had always been reserved, found himself embracing his role as a leader and advocate. His story, and his calm, steadfast demeanor, continued to inspire people from all walks of life. Madison's transformation was even more profound. She used her platform not to seek redemption, but to amplify the voices of others. She often deferred to Alexander or the veterans they worked with, recognizing that their experiences carried far more weight than her own. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser, Alexander and Madison sat together, reflecting on their journey. "You've come a long way," Alexander said, offering a rare smile. "So have you," Madison replied. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Alexander nodded. "I think we are. But the fight isn't over." A legacy cemented. 2 years after the summit, the Department of Defense announced a sweeping initiative to review all records of marginalized soldiers from World War II to the present. The initiative was a direct result of the advocacy sparked by the 761st Tank Battalion story. The Legacy of Service Foundation played a key role in the effort, providing research and testimony that led to the posthumous recognition of hundreds of soldiers. Schools across the country began adopting the Foundation's curriculum, ensuring that future generations would learn a more complete and inclusive history, a monument to honor them. The culmination of their work came with the unveiling of a national monument dedicated to the 761st Tank Battalion and other segregated units. The monument, located on the National Mall, featured bronze statues of soldiers in battle, their expressions resolute and unyielding. Inscribed at the base were the words, "For those who fought with courage, even when the world did not see them." At the unveiling ceremony, Alexander and Madison stood together, surrounded by veterans, families, and supporters. Madison held her grandfather's journal in her hands, while Alexander wore the medals he had earned during his own service. As the ceremony concluded, Madison looked at Alexander. "Do you think they'd be proud?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, his gaze fixed on the monument. "I think they'd be proud we're finally telling the truth." The journey continues. The fight for justice and recognition didn't end with the monument. Alexander and Madison knew there were still stories to uncover, battles to fight, and minds to change. But they also knew they weren't alone. Together, and with the support of a growing community, they continued to honor the past while shaping a better future. And in their shared journey, they found not just purpose but an enduring friendship, a testament to the power of growth, reconciliation, and the pursuit of truth. A new chapter. The unveiling of the monument dedicated to the 761st Tank Battalion marked a milestone. But for Alexander Bennett and Madison Harper, it was far from the final step in their journey. As the crowd dispersed, families lingered, touching the bronze statues, sharing stories, and finding solace in the long-overdue acknowledgement of their loved ones' sacrifices. Madison stood silently, her fingers tracing the inscription at the base of the monument. Her grandfather's journal rested in her other hand, a constant reminder of how far she had come and how much further she still needed to go. She turned to Alexander, who stood nearby, speaking with an elderly veteran who had served alongside his great-uncle. "Alex," Madison said softly when the conversation ended, "I've been thinking." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "This isn't just about history, is it?" she continued. "It's about the future, about making sure that people today don't have to fight the same battles our families did." Alexander nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's always been the goal. The monument is important, but it's just a symbol. What matters is what we do next. A pledge for the future." That evening, Alexander and Madison met with Claire Richardson and a handful of close allies from the Legacy of Service Foundation. They sat around a large table, the atmosphere buzzing with ideas. "We've got the public's attention now," Claire said. "The question is, how do we keep it?" Alexander leaned forward. "We need to focus on action. Partner with schools to get the curriculum out faster. Expand our grants for minority veterans. And we need to push for more transparency in the military's historical records." Madison added, "We should also invest in storytelling, books, films, even community events. People connect with stories. It's how they learn, how they empathize." The group agreed, drafting a bold plan for the next 5 years. Their vision was ambitious: to build a network of educators, veterans, and advocates who could ensure that the lessons of the past shaped a more equitable future. A personal victory. A few months later, Madison received an unexpected call. It was from her father, who had remained distant throughout much of her transformation. He had been skeptical of her involvement in the documentary, dismissing it as a publicity stunt. "I watched the documentary," he said abruptly, "and I read the journal. Your uncle showed it to me." Madison's heart raced. "And," her father's voice softened, "I didn't know, Maddie. About Dad. About everything he went through. I guess I never wanted to know. But I'm proud of you for bringing his story to light." Tears welled in Madison's eyes. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot. I'd like to visit the monument with you," he said after a pause, "if you're willing." Madison agreed, and a week later, they stood together in front of the statues. Her father placed a hand on the bronze figure representing Charles Green and whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have done more to remember you." For Madison, it was a moment of closure, a sign that even the most entrenched beliefs could shift when faced with the truth. Alexander's next mission. Meanwhile, Alexander found himself drawn back to his roots. Inspired by the recognition of the 761st, he began working with young veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. He started a mentorship program, pairing them with older veterans who could guide them through the challenges of transitioning to a new normal. One day, during a workshop, a young veteran approached him. "Sergeant Bennett," the man said, his voice hesitant, "I saw the documentary. It made me proud to serve, knowing I'm standing on the shoulders of giants." Alexander smiled, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "That's exactly why we do this, to remind people like you that your service matters and that your story is part of something bigger." The summit's legacy. 5 years after the summit that launched their partnership, the Legacy of Service Foundation had achieved remarkable milestones. Over 500 schools had adopted its curriculum, and the Department of Defense had officially recognized several previously overlooked units for their service. The Foundation's veteran support programs had helped thousands of marginalized veterans access education, healthcare, and career opportunities. Madison and Alexander remained at the helm, their partnership evolving into a deep friendship rooted in mutual respect. They often reflected on how a chance encounter, marked by conflict and misunderstanding, had transformed their lives and those of countless others. The final tribute. On the 10th anniversary of the documentary's release, a special event was held at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Veterans, families, educators, and advocates gathered to celebrate the ongoing impact of the 761st story. Madison, now a seasoned advocate, took the stage to deliver a speech. She held her grandfather's journal, its once-worn cover now carefully preserved. "When I first learned about my grandfather's story, I felt ashamed. Ashamed of how little I knew and how much I had taken for granted," she began. "But I also felt inspired. Inspired by the courage of men like him, and by the possibility of a world where their sacrifices are never forgotten." She paused, her voice steady. "This isn't just about looking back. It's about moving forward, about ensuring that every soldier, every citizen, knows that they are seen, valued, and respected. That's the legacy we're building together." Alexander followed her, his presence commanding as always. "The men of the 761st didn't fight for recognition," he said. "They fought for an idea, the idea that freedom and equality are worth any sacrifice. Today, we honor that idea by continuing their fight in whatever way we can." A story completed, a legacy continued. As the event concluded, Madison and Alexander stood side by side, watching as visitors explored the museum's expanded exhibit on the 761st. Nearby, a young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing to a photo of Charles Green. "Mommy, was he a hero?" the girl asked. "Yes, sweetheart," her mother replied. "He was a hero." Madison felt a lump in her throat as she turned to Alexander. "We did it," she said softly. "We told their story." Alexander nodded, his gaze steady. "And we'll keep telling it, because some stories deserve to be told forever." The two of them stood in silence, watching as a new generation learned about the sacrifices of the past and the promise of a better tomorrow.